Hi everyone, thank you for being here, and hello you all. I'll be happy if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little about you and what your company is doing. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Seetvun. I'm a Director of Product and Engineering at Liveperson. At Liveperson, we build an AI-powered conversational commerce platform, basically enabling brands to communicate with their end consumers across all the different messaging channels. And our main focus is really how do we, on the one hand, create operational efficiency for large enterprises while still maintaining a really superior consumer experience. And bots and AI are a critical part of that, of course.
Thanks.
Hello everybody, my name is Marcelo Bacher. I'm from Applied Materials. For someone who doesn't know what Applied Materials has to do with AI, Applied Materials is a global company in the area of semiconductors with center in Santa Clara. We have here in Rehovot the major R&D development center outside the States. And what we do here is the development of the equipment for the semiconductor industry, as well as all the algorithmics that goes inside the equipment based on machine learning, all the techniques involved, of course, deep learning and mature statistics stuff, challenges that serve the customer in order to make better products in the line.
I'm Ohad, CTO and co-founder of Namogoo, a startup of 100 employees. We disrupt the digital experience market by protecting the customer journey of online companies, specifically retail and fintech. We are deployed on the journey of the customer and making sure that no invasive ads or code is being injected into the journey by third parties of all kinds that exist on the journey. We work with companies like Gap, like Next, like Walmart, like Hudson's Bay, Dollar Shave Club, so leading retailers in the market. And the approach that we took to deal with this challenge is learning and AI, because the amount of patterns that exist out there on the web is enormous.
Hi, I'm Ira Cohen. I'm Chief Data Scientist and one of the founders of Anodot. A little bit about Anodot. First, 3 companies here are in Ra'anana.
Ra'anana
the
rules.
same area, probably within a kilometer. Yeah, Rehovot. Yeah, so you're the outlier. And that's what we do. Actually, we find outliers in data. That's what Anodot does. So I always look for the outliers. And we find it so businesses can make sure that their business operations is on track and there is nothing abnormal happening. We have over 100 customers, companies like Facebook and Wix in Israel. Liveperson is a big customer for several years already. Namogoo was almost a customer. Yeah, so that's what we do. We collect all the telemetry data and time series data related to business performance, find the abnormal behaviors that usually indicate issues in the business ecosystem.
Cool, so thank you all. And we'll start with the first question. There are many global R&D companies who decide to open an R&D center that specializes with AI. A lot of focus of AI. You mentioned a lot of AI tools and technical that you develop here. What do you think that is the reason why those companies choose specific AI in Israel? They can use AI or build AI centers all over the world. So we can see a lot of companies, Booking, LogMeIn, have only AI operation in Israel. To your opinion, why do you think it's happened in Israel?
So I think it's not just AI. We know that in general, a lot of the companies are acquiring companies in Israel, setting R&D centers here. And I think in general, Israel is an innovative space. So AI is just part of that, right? It's the latest trend. We're always up to speed in terms of technology. So this is a good place for companies to do that, and companies that are actually looking for disruption or to be able to be on top of the trends can find it in Israel very, very easily. I think of course, this is also many times a matter of cost. We can't ignore that. The cost relative to the talent overall is obviously very good here in Israel. So I think that's also another...
Yes.
We'll talk about Applied Materials. It's an American company based on Santa Clara, which the innovation per square feet is quite high, but they still decided to build here the major center of R&D outside the States. And the Applied Materials also invest over the years around $2 billion in development, not only equipment, but also to put into the people here, actually, to reinforce the learning, to lead the development on the AI here in Israel. And I personally think it's mostly because of the people, the engagement of the people, the innovation, and the thirst to get the things done, especially here.
I agree with everything you said. Also, I divide it to three main things. So one is talent, which is amazing. One of the guys beforehand mentioned Talpiot and 8200. We have amazing talents that are trained in the army for these kind of things. The second aspect is academia. So I think we have great universities and research done in Israel, which helps a lot in pushing these areas, and specifically AI and data-related fields. And the last one is the culture that we have in Israel specifically, regardless the talent, which is all around creativity and focus on solving a problem, and especially I think specifically in fields like AI and learning. If you're not focused on the business mission, you can get lost. And I think what's, at least in my opinion, specializes very special to specific to the Israeli talent is we're very focused on the mission. And I think it helps us in doing research right.
Amazing.
So I'm going to repeat everything you said. It's actually, so my first job was in my undergrad was in what became Applied Material in Israel. It was called Opal at the time. And it was the first time in 1998 that I was exposed to pattern recognition. Nobody called it AI, nobody called it machine learning. It was pattern recognition, but it was learning. It was definitely learning. And I think academia here historically has been really strong in machine learning, even before machine learning became popular. So if you look in Hebrew University, you have Nir Friedman, who's been doing Bayesian networks since the early 90s, Naftali Tishby, Lior Wolf in computer vision in Tel Aviv. I think the reason it became strong here, because it used to be not a field that required a lot of capital. There was more theory and smaller experience. You didn't need huge data centers and computers to do it, so it was easier for researchers here to do it. And they became leaders. I mean, machine learning conferences in the early 2000s were dominated by Israelis, definitely. So when it became popular and when it broke out, Israel became, it was easy for Israel to become a stronghold of that. And of course, there is the culture and the army that deals with huge amounts of data for existential reasons, which made it, really strong. And the culture of an AI, especially the culture of development in AI, is very researchy. So you don't know a priori that it's very non-deterministic. You don't know that it's going to succeed. So having the mentality of not being afraid to fail really helps in this field, more than maybe other fields.
Right. Would you like to comment also?
Yeah, I just want to add that I think the army is, like was said here, is a key point here. So Ohad mentioned we are very focused. We keep eyes on the target. I think a lot of the things that we acquire in the army are very useful especially in this space, the fact that we are able to focus is very important because it's a space that is very easy to get lost in. So I definitely think this is one of the maybe differentiators versus other places in the world.
Interesting. So thanks you all. My next question, do you think it's good for Israel to have such big amount of global R&D centers here in Israel? Because sometimes we hear some people say that they came and they take all the good talent and they pay very high amount of money to those people. What do you think? It's good? It's bad? Somewhere in the middle?
I think it's definitely good.
Yes?
The ones that
As a
say,
startup.
the ones that, as a startup, the ones that are afraid of the big guys to come and take over, I think it means that they're not fast enough and not creative enough. There's nothing to be afraid of. I think the opposite. I think the existence of big companies creates great opportunities. We specifically work with Google and Microsoft very closely on co-sell activities, on research activities. So I think it creates great opportunities. I think we can learn a lot from big companies in terms of methodologies. I think if you, and also I think, by the way, we hire a lot of people, and I think I split the world into employees that like startups and employees that don't like startups. Usually there are startup employees and not non-startup employees. Those that are here want to be here, and those that are here want to be here. And I think there is place for all. And I think we need to take advantage of each other and encourage it. Just yesterday, there was announced an acquisition of Dynamic Yield done by McDonald's. I think it's amazing.
Yes.
So the more the merrier.
Great. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's pushing the whole ecosystem forward. And I agree, competition is always a good thing, right?
Yes.
It always makes you better. And I think that also, it's, at the end of the day, it's an enabler for the startups, right? Because you don't just, usually, most people don't just finish school and go ahead and basically found their own startup. So a lot of the learnings that you gain, a lot of the experience that eventually enables you to have a successful startup is also gained in the big companies.
Global companies.
So that's also an advantage.
Okay, great.
Let's call it competition.
Okay.
In my case, I have the experience not long experience here in Israel, but working in a startup and also working in applied materials. And as you say, there is a culture of what a startup does, or the culture within the startup and the culture within the big companies. Nevertheless, not long a friend of mine, Ph.D. also a friend of mine, he did research which says the average time of worker from in Facebook was around 1.5 years.
Wow, that's it.
That's it. After 1.5 years, people usually leave
Wow.
Facebook, I'm talking about. Whereas in applied materials, we can find 20 years people working there. So maybe it's, at the beginning, of course, there is a gravity of the huge mass of companies that attract people. And once they can learn what they would like to learn, there are people who just go out and try
And spread their knowledge.
their own way by themselves. Yeah.
Yes.
So in that case, I agree. That's the triggers and the move forward, the competition, and also new ideas.
Great. You're
Yeah, so in general, I don't think, I think I agree with everything.
You all agree all the time.
There is there's not a lot of flip side to having these global centers. Employees that want startups go to startups. It does create a bit of pressure, financial pressures on startups.
Okay.
Because you have to increase salaries. You have to be somewhat competitive. I mean, we cannot match some of the salaries that they offer, and certainly the conditions, Facebook giving 3 meals a day and all sorts of things like that. But we can't be 50% of that. So it does present a challenge in terms of funding, which means we have to take bigger rounds. But we're still far from, I mean, the gap, especially in AI data science, the gap is still, compared to Bay Area, Seattle, and other places in the US, there's still a huge gap, even with the increase of salaries in this field here in Israel.
Okay, cool.
So it's still okay.
Yeah, it still makes sense to hire Israeli employees. Great. So my next question is, what do you think is like the main problem or pain of global R&D centers, and do you think it will make them dive in also to Israel or open more parts, or the problems they have today struggles and they cannot allow to have more people? So what do you think is the main problem of global R&D centers?
So I think basically being here in Israel, we can't ignore the fact that we're far away from the main markets, US, Europe, so we're not actually part of that. I think that is a disadvantage for us, that we obviously we can cope with it, but we need to be aware of it. And another point is obviously cultural differences. So the Israeli culture is very unique. It's
I like the word unique.
It's unique. It's our differentiation,
Yes.
I think, on the one hand.
Yes.
It's what makes us special, but it's also something that is sometimes creating challenges when we work in global organizations. And I think I see it a lot in the everyday work. So we just, as long as we keep that in mind, we can always cope with it and see how we turn it into a positive
Yes.
outcome. But if we relate to the previous question, actually having global companies in Israel, big companies, helps with that gap as well, because people learn and adapt, and they learn to work in global companies, and that makes it easier for them down the line to cope with those challenges as well.
Okay, great.
Where she was talking, I was trying to find out a good answer. I think the geographic position is quite complicated in that sense. My personal experience, I working also in Europe, and when you have a big company there and the lack of people, you would like to, you can bring people from around.
Okay.
So we'll supply you the resources that you might need. In Israel, it's sometimes really difficult to fill up the gap in that case.
Okay, interesting.
I agree on the cultural gaps, let's call it. I think that in geographies like countries like in the US, there are about 10% managers and 90% are the ones that are doing the work. In Israel, it's exactly the opposite. Everyone wants to create direction, everyone wants to be creative, he wants to run in his own route. And I think it's a challenge to keep, first to take advantage of the culture in each geography, and also to bridge this gap between these two cultures and somehow create a good bridge that would take the great talent and great creativity into the business direction that's usually defined in the main headquarters, which is US or Europe.
Great. Europe?
So I think the trick to having a good R&D center in Israel is to give it a lot of autonomy.
Okay.
To give it actually a product,
To work.
not just R&D as part of one big other product, but having independent products that come out of it, and then a lot of the issues of being far from the center or not being close to the business becomes less relevant. I haven't checked all the companies that have R&D centers. I worked for HP here. I know a lot about IBM and others. And I think where it worked well is when the R&D group had autonomy over some of the business. So they still reported, and the direction was from the corporate, but there was a lot of autonomy, and then it worked well, because we're Israelis, we don't like to be told what to do.
Yeah.
So
Great.
that's the reason.
I have something to add. I grew up in IBM research many years, and I think IBM research is one of the most successful examples for research centers. We were about 3,000 employees. Now it's much more, but I think one of the things that IBM changed over the years is to give autonomy. I very much agree with what you said. So in projects in IBM Research, the corporate gives you 50% of the budget, and 50% you have to bring yourself. And I think it creates, it makes you think, it makes you work hard. Once you need to go and raise your funding, raise your money, you need to be creative, you need to be close to market. I think examples that are usually not good is examples where the Israeli R&D kind of serves the main headquarters and is not trained and expected to be independent. And I think that's a good, successful example, in my opinion, for a good research center.
Great, so thank you. So my last question, we don't have a lot of time, is do you think that those companies should buy an Israeli startup and then launch their activity in Israel? Or they should start from the beginning and start to recruit people? So what do you think is the best practice for them, for global companies, to start their first initiative in Israel?
So I think it really depends what they're trying to achieve, what's the goal. If the goal is to achieve some kind of disruption within the company or innovation, then a lot of the times buying a company is the right move. Also, if it's penetration to a new market or strengthening a certain capability the company has, in those cases, definitely buying a startup company is the right move to go with. But on the other hand, it creates a lot of challenges, as we were mentioned, in terms of merging that startup into the whole operations of a big company. So if the company is looking, if the goal is different, if it's talent acquisition, and the company knows the exact direction they want to go with, it's probably easier to start from scratch.
Okay.
That way you can really shape that center the way you would want it, build it from the ground, attached to the company culture. It helps you bridge those gaps where when buying a startup, you know, you get
the full package.
Exactly. You get the full package, pros and cons.
Great, thanks.
I think also it depends on what the goal of acquisition of a big company from a startup is.
Mm-hmm.
If it's just because of the patents or not to develop a local market.
Mm-hmm.
And
no, let's, for example, if they want access to very talented people. If we are talking about AI
in that
and
case,
they want AI capabilities, starting to recruiting everyone from scratch is very hard.
In that case, for example, Applied Materials bought 30 years ago a local company,
Mm-hmm.
and from there it started recruiting talent people here to make the Applied Materials Israel almost an autonomous place of development and research. There are many companies that just buy the company in order to be able or to buy the patent, but those don't give actually the resources in order to develop. So if the chances are that the big company buys a local one or a startup in order to improve the quality of the product by recruiting people or also investing in people, that will actually be beneficial for Israel.
Okay, great.
So I'm a great believer in land and expand approach in everything that we do, or MVP or land and expand. There are many names for it, but starting with something that exists and then building things on it. So also in growing a branch in another company, in another country, like in Israel, at least in my opinion, there's no doubt that it's much better to start with an anchor, and then upon it, and then on it, and then grow it. It's not just, so I agree with what Uri said about hiring people. Hiring people in any geography is hard, specifically in Israel, where there's great competition. It's very hard.
Field.
Specifically AI, extremely hard. And I think the advantage of starting with something that exists is that you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from a machine, a well-oiled machine that's working. You are acquiring a group of people that like working together, that are used to working together, that are used to building things together, and then you build on it. Once you start from scratch, you're like it's a very risky move.
Okay.
In my opinion.
I'm not sure I can recall any example of a company that started from scratch. Maybe Microsoft in Israel, I think, but that started with Moshe Lichtman coming, being executive VP in
Google
Microsoft,
also, I think,
and deciding to come back to Israel. So he knew what he was coming for. Maybe Facebook, not Facebook, Amazon, I think, similar to that. But I don't know. All the examples I can think of were started from acquisitions. Facebook was an acquisition of Lenovo.
Amazon also acquired the first company.
Really? Yeah. So I don't know.
You think this is the best practice, just to buy a company and then move on?
Anybody wants to buy? We have some startups here.
Great, excellent. So last question. Do you think we will still see global companies launching or buying new startups and then having activity in Israel? Or we just reach to the limit, everyone has already opened R&D centers, and companies might not do it at all, so maybe to go to Ukraine or other places. So do you think that we will keep growing in this part, or we will just be in the same area for the last couple of years?
I think Ukraine and Eastern Europe is a different kind of branches. I think we will definitely see more and more companies opening centers in Israel. Just yesterday, McDonald's, who would think?
Yeah, who would believe?
Who would think that,
center,
Exactly, so I think we haven't reached the limit, and big companies continue to evolve. Mid-sized companies become big companies now. The amount of unicorns that are growing faster, it becomes much faster because it's much easier today to become a unicorn faster than before. So I think we will see this movement in existing verticals that we see today, and also in new verticals that will evolve.
Great, thanks. Ira, would you like to comment?
I agree. I don't think this is
you think we will see many other companies following and just having more R&D centers in Israel?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always amazed how many big companies there are in the world that we don't even know about.
There is still a whole list of companies who can come.
Huge list, yeah.
But we have to be good, otherwise it will stop.
Yeah, I was going to say I agree, but it doesn't mean that we can, lay back. And I think it's also our culture, but we have to constantly think how we innovate, how our academy is getting better, I think the point that we maybe need to get better at is how do we also consume the technologies, because I feel Israel is very technological in terms of the development, but on the other hand, as consumers, we're very much behind
also as a government,
markets of the world. Right. So
Explorer only.
So if we want to keep that growth, I think there are things that we need to do better in the future.
So you say you think it will happen, keep happening, but it's not for sure. We need to still work hard.
Like every company, there's always competition, right?
Yeah.
There is other countries. There are cheaper places. And we have our disadvantages as well. So I think that we are very good, and I think we will keep growing, but we have to also constantly challenge ourselves. How do we get to the next stage?
Cool.
Actually, it's really hard to add something new. What has been taught here. I do agree. And hopefully we will see other companies being bought by other companies in order to expand the local market, and also to acquire, do acquisition, and also invest in people to train them and become bigger center of excellence around the world. Not just bad news about Israel, but really to be known about what our capabilities are.
Great, so thanks. We're just right on time. Thank you all, and thank you all also. Thanks.
Thank you very much for saying. Thank you.